Whew. If I look cold, it's because I'm cold. How cold is it, you might ask? I'm wearing shoes. I am wearing shoes.
Hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right.
This is the first video I will have recorded after the 2025 trip I took to Los Angeles, California. That was the trip, yes, that turned out to have a little more heat than expected. Anyway, when you're having an intellectual disagreement with someone, sometimes it's helpful to have analogies or exercises to help illustrate the point. To that end, you may have seen a previous video of mine called a modesty diagram. In that video, I propose that Christian naturists provide Christian textiles with this diagram, or just naturists in general, of course. The idea is that textiles, Christian textiles, should cover in parts of the body that they think should be covered, but you're only allowed to cover in that part of the body if you can draw a line and write down a Bible verse next to it. And the verse has to say that that part of the body has to be covered on a universal scale across the entire human species. Spoiler alert, no such verses exist. That's kind of the point of the diagram. Well, I have a new exercise for discussing naturism with Christian textiles. The 10 Commandments. A talking point common among Christian naturists when we talk about naturism is, with how important Christian textiles take this whole anti-nakedness stance to be, you'd expect it to be among the 10 Commandments, but it's not. An 11th commandment, if you will, that doesn't exist. Textiles tend to balk at this, but let's give it some serious thought. But before we do, let's talk about Patreon. That's right, this episode of Mudwalkers has been brought to you by Patreon. These guys are my patrons. They're making the channel happen. They're keeping my work sustainable. And guys, I just cannot thank you enough for everything you're doing over on Patreon. You really are making my work possible. I was able to go to not just one, not three, but 2 World Naked Bike rides last year thanks to your support on Patreon. If you'd like to learn how to support me on Patreon, there will be a link in the description down below to Patreon. Also, check out my Linktree where you can find all my important social media and my website. Now I have a website, it's called nakedmeanshuman.com. No dashes, no capitals, just nakedmeanshuman.com. All one word except dot. The website is important because it's cool, but also important because it has a newsletter in there where you can sign up and get regular updates from me and Mudwalkers to kind of get my travel plans in general, upcoming videos, recent videos, content. So yeah, anyway, that about covers Patreon. Except for the benefits of the Patreon tiers. It's obvious I haven't recorded a video in a while, if you haven't noticed. It's been, yeah, I think since before Christmas, since I recorded a video. Anyhow, on Mudwalkers Patreon, you get a bunch of great benefits, among them being at the Mudwalker level and above, you get access to a monthly Zoom call with me and the other patrons at those levels. It's a fantastic time. I love those calls. We get to hang out and have fun, share stories, swap ideas, and overall just have a great time. I look forward to seeing you there. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, do sign up for the newsletter on the website. It is free. All the tiers on Patreon get early access to all my mainline content, videos like this one, but at the Mudwalker level and above, you also get access to all my other content like World Naked Bike Ride videos, naturist resort tours, behind the scenes footage, stuff like that. Without further ado, let's get back into the 10 Commandments. Or should it be 11? So obviously, I am not a textile, despite appearances. But I will do my best to simulate textile responses to these questions.
I have now successfully blended into your society.
Because you see, in the 10 Commandments exercise we have here, It's a multiple choice questionnaire. All the answers are less important, as important, or more important. So you get to each of the 10 commandments and you ask this question of the textile. Is the prohibition of nakedness less important, as important, or more important than this given 10 commandment? This given, that sounds weird to say, the 10 commandment. Than this commandment.
English, mother, do you speak it?
So let's take a look. You shall have no gods before me. Is this less important, more important, or as important as this commandment? Now, as this simulated textile version of myself, I'm going to say less important than idolatry. Commandment number 2, no physical idols. Also less important. That would be the nakedness thing being less important than the idols. Commandment number 3, don't abuse Yahweh's name in false oaths. This one's tricky because I think some textiles would say that clothing is more important than taking the Lord's name in vain. But let's say less important for argument's sake, because I think you'll find the next few answers interesting. Observe Shabbat. You should observe the 7th day's rest. That is the 4th commandment. A lot of the Protestants I know, because I don't know many Catholics, a lot of the Protestants I know don't observe Shabbat at all, not even a day of rest. They just do whatever they want. They work and stuff like that, and a lot of them just don't observe Shabbat. And I think a lot of those people would say that prohibiting nakedness is more important than keeping the 7th day of rest. Commandment number 5, care for your parents honorably as they age. Prohibiting nakedness, more important than that one. How about murder? Prohibiting nakedness, less important than murder. Is prohibiting nakedness less important, as important, or more important than prohibiting adultery? I think a lot of textiles would say it's as important because to a lot of textiles, it's tantamount to adultery. Commandment number 8, don't steal stuff. Is prohibiting nakedness more important, as important, or less important than that one? I think as important. Don't perjure yourself. The little known 9th commandment. Yep, 9th commandment. So is prohibiting social nudity less important, as important, or more important than prohibiting perjury? As important as perjury. As important. Number 10. That famous number 10. Do not covet anything that is your neighbor's. Now what is coveting? Coveting is fixating on acquiring something that you have no right to have. Whether you get it or not, whether you physically attempt to get it or not is not the point. See my video on properly defining lust. So, is prohibiting social nudity less important, as important, or more important than prohibiting covetousness? As important, I think. Of course, these answers are going to vary textile to textile. Like I said, I'm just simulating based on my impression of textiles that I know. But if you're a textile or you know some textiles with answers for these, by all means put them in the comments and we'll see how it turns out. Another way of asking this same kind of question around the commandments is by pairing naturism with a commandment. Let's take Shabbat, for example. Ask the textile, would you rather I was a naturist, but I observed the trees are crumbling around me?
The sky is falling! The sky is falling!
Would you rather I was a naturist, but I did observe Shabbat, or I was not a naturist, but I also didn't observe the Sabbath? The answers are going to vary. The idea is, okay, you think naturism is a sin, but which sin is really worse? About murder, would you rather I was a nudist and not a murderer, or a murderer but not a nudist? I think a lot of people are going to say, I would rather you be a nudist, just not a murderer.
Please don't kill me!
But But for some of these other ones where it's actually, the answer is that naturism is more important to prohibit than some of the commandments, that's where things get really interesting. Because essentially, we have seen that according to textiles, banning naturism is at least as important as the Ten Commandments, if not more important than several of the Ten Commandments. If that's the case, then God really should have said that. But he didn't, which leaves us with only two options for why, as far as I can tell. Maybe there are more options I just haven't thought of. Let me know in the comments. But leaves us with just two viable options, I think, for why God wouldn't mention this. Either God made a grievous omission from Scripture. I really hope you can hear these geese. Hello. Either God made a grievous omission from the Bible on this point, or this simply is not as egregious or important an issue to God as it is to you, my dear textile.
We must overreact immediately.
Now, don't think I haven't heard people try to argue for a third option, because they do. The third option is, well, this is just so obvious a thing that you should do that it didn't even have to be put in the Bible. God knows we just know this one. Yeah, so this one is so obvious that Native Hawaiians were naked, Native Pacific Islanders were naked, Native Africans were naked all over the continent, naked Egyptians were all over the place. The Greeks were naked, the Romans were naked, a lot of the barbarians in Europe were naked in the ancient times. You've got all kinds of Native Americans all over North America that were naked all over the place, Mesoamerica, South America, everywhere, basically. Every single habitable continent across human history has lots of cultures where nakedness was accepted with a yawn, where it just was not a big deal to people. So it looks like it's not as obvious as these textiles want it to be. But again, you think clothes are more obvious than murder? You think it's more obvious to the human soul that I should have pants on than that I shouldn't be strangling my children at the dinner table. If that's your position, then own it. I think that's kind of nuts. I think that's really, really nuts, because every single culture on the planet has rules against certain, at least some, unjustified killings. There's always reasons not to kill people in every single culture, but not every culture, by a wide margin, not every culture has a rule against nakedness, not even the important areas. So no, I'm not going to say anthropologically, historically, culturally speaking, that this was at all obvious to these cultures. It wasn't, and it still isn't to a lot of cultures. Okay. Soapbox side quest complete. All that to say, it's not as obvious as some American Christians like to think. And God didn't put it in the Bible, despite the fact that many Christian textiles think that this is actually more obvious and more important than some of the Ten Commandments. So either God left this one out, and that's kind of a boo-boo, or you need to rethink your position on this, because clearly it's not the same as God's. Food for thought. Love you.